Pathetic girl, you were never the smart one. My dad reminded me. Then my name was all over the news, stating I had become the youngest female CEO in the country. At the family reunion, when they saw me arrive in my Rolls-Royce, I kept my successful business secret for years. Then my family found out my net worth. The first time I sat down at my kitchen table with nothing but a laptop and an idea, I never imagined it would lead to this. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a side hustle, a way to make ends meet while juggling the demands of being a mother, wife, and daughter. But as months turned into years, that small spark grew into something far bigger than I could have ever anticipated. And yet, no one in my family knew about it. Not really. It started innocently enough. I was scrolling through social media late one night when I stumbled across a post from someone who had built their own online business selling handmade crafts. At the time, I was working part-time at a local cafe just to contribute financially to our household. My husband, Mark, worked long hours as a mechanic, and we were barely scraping by. We weren't struggling so much that we couldn't afford groceries or keep the lights on, but there was always this looming sense of uncertainty, like any unexpected expense could send us spiraling. So when I saw that post, something clicked inside me. What if I could do that too? I didn't tell anyone, not even Mark, what I was planning. Part of it was fear. What if I failed? The thought of admitting I'd wasted time and energy on something that didn't pan out felt unbearable. But another part of it was pride. This was mine. Something I could control, nurture, and grow without needing anyone else's approval or validation. Every spare moment I had, from nap times to after bedtime, I poured myself into learning everything I could about e-commerce, marketing, and branding. I spent hours watching tutorials, reading articles, and experimenting with different ideas until finally, I launched my first product line, custom-designed jewelry inspired by nature. At first, sales trickled in slowly. A pair of earrings here, a necklace there. Nothing spectacular, but enough to give me hope. As the months went on though, things began to pick up. Word spread organically, thanks to glowing reviews and repeat customers. Before I knew it, I was shipping orders all over the country, and eventually, internationally. Still, I kept it hidden. Mark thought the extra income came from occasional freelance graphic design work, which I did dabble in, and my kids assumed Mom was just working on her computer like she always did. They had no idea how big it had become. By year 3, the numbers were staggering, or at least they felt that way to me. 6 figures in revenue, growing steadily each month. I hired virtual assistants to help manage customer service and inventory. I leased warehouse space under a pseudonym to store products. Everything was meticulously planned and executed behind closed doors. To everyone around me, I was still the same person. The quiet, dependable mom who baked cookies for school events and volunteered at church. Inside, however, I was bursting with secrets. But keeping such a massive part of my life under wraps took its toll. There were moments when guilt gnawed at me, especially during family dinners where conversations revolved around budgeting and saving for vacations or home repairs. Should I speak up, offer to cover some expenses, or continue letting them think we were barely getting by? Each decision weighed heavily on my shoulders, and the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became to imagine revealing the truth. Then came the day everything changed. It started innocently enough, a routine visit to the bank. I needed to deposit a check from one of my suppliers, nothing unusual. Except this time, the teller looked at me strangely before excusing herself to fetch her manager. When he returned, his demeanor shifted entirely. Gone was the polite professionalism instead. There was a kind of awe mixed with disbelief. He asked me to step into his office, where he proceeded to congratulate me on building such a successful enterprise. Apparently, my account activity had flagged some internal review process, and they wanted to ensure I had access to premium services tailored to high-net-worth clients. My stomach dropped. While I appreciated their enthusiasm, the last thing I needed was attention. I politely declined their offers, insisting I preferred to keep things simple. But as I left the bank, I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had been set in motion. Sure enough, later that evening, Mark received a call from a mutual acquaintance who happened to work at the same branch. By the next morning, the entire family knew, or at least suspected, something wasn't adding up. When I walked into the living room that night, the air felt thick with tension. Mark sat on the couch, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Our 2 teenagers, Emily and Jake, perched awkwardly on either side of him, their eyes darting between their father and me. No one said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. Finally, Mark broke it. "What exactly is going on?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "The bank called today. They told me, well, let's just say they painted quite the picture." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. All those years of secrecy, of carefully guarding my double life, suddenly seemed futile. How could I explain this without sounding defensive or secretive? Taking a deep breath, I sank onto the armchair opposite them, bracing myself for the storm ahead. I didn't mean to hide it, I began hesitantly, my voice trembling. It started small, almost by accident. You remember those craft fairs I used to attend? Well, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, words tumbled out faster than I could organize them, spilling forth in a chaotic rush. I told them about the late nights, the endless research, the thrill of seeing my designs come to life. I explained how terrified I'd been of failing, not just financially, but emotionally. What if they resented me for not sharing sooner? What if they thought I valued success over family? Mark listened intently, his face unreadable throughout my confession. Emily, ever the emotional one, blinked back tears, while Jake stared at me with wide eyes, clearly trying to reconcile the image of his mom with this newfound revelation. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and drained, Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked softly, his tone less accusatory now and more curious. "We're your family. Don't you trust us?" His question hit me like a punch to the gut. Of course I trusted them. More than anything. But trust wasn't the issue. It was vulnerability. Admitting I'd built something extraordinary meant opening myself up to judgment, scrutiny, and maybe even jealousy. Would they see me differently? Treat me differently? These fears had kept me locked in a prison of my own making, and now staring at their faces, I realized how foolish I'd been. I was scared, I admitted quietly, tears streaming down my cheeks. Scared of ruining what we have. Scared of disappointing you. Scared of losing myself. For a moment, nobody moved. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the soft of the ceiling fan above us. Then, unexpectedly, Emily reached out and grabbed my hand. "Mom," she said gently, her voice thick with emotion, "you didn't ruin anything. You made something amazing. We're proud of you." Her words broke something loose inside me, a dam holding back years of pent-up emotions. Sobs racked my body as I clung to her, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Slowly Mark and Jake joined in, wrapping their arms around me in a tight embrace. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a wife, mother, or entrepreneur, but as a whole person. Yet even as the initial shock wore off, the ripple effects of my secret began to surface. Over the following weeks, questions arose about finances, priorities, and the future. Mark struggled with feelings of inadequacy, wondering why I hadn't confided in him sooner. Emily and Jake grappled with their own mix of pride and confusion, unsure how to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the powerhouse she'd become. And me? I wrestled with guilt, joy, and a profound sense of liberation, all intertwined in ways I couldn't untangle. One evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, Mark broached the subject again. "So what happens now?" he asked, his gaze steady. "Do we move? Travel? Invest? Start over completely?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Truthfully, I hadn't given much thought to the practical implications of my success beyond ensuring financial stability, but listening to him, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about choices that would shape not only my future but theirs as well. "We figure it out together," I replied finally, meeting his eyes with determination. "Whatever we decide, we do it as a family." And so began a new chapter, one filled with possibilities, challenges, and countless opportunities to redefine who we were and who we wanted to become. Little did I know, however, that the hardest decisions were still ahead. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, conversations, and revelations. Each family member processed the news in their own way, and as much as I wanted to believe we could move forward seamlessly, the reality was far messier. The weight of my secret had created cracks beneath the surface, cracks that couldn't be ignored or smoothed over with a few heartfelt talks. Mark, for instance, oscillated between pride and insecurity. One moment he'd marvel at what I'd accomplished, peppering me with questions about how I managed logistics, marketing, and scaling the business. The next, he'd retreat into silence, his jaw tight as he stared out the window during our evening walks. It wasn't hard to guess what plagued him: feelings of inadequacy. He'd always been the primary breadwinner, working long hours under the hood of cars, his hands calloused and grease-streaked. Now confronted with the enormity of my success, he questioned his own contributions, not just financially but emotionally. "Do you think I'm enough?" he asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. We were lying in bed, the house quiet except for the faint of the refrigerator downstairs. His question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected but because it cut so deeply. I turned to face him, reaching out to take his hand. "Of course you are," I said firmly. "You've carried this family on your shoulders for years. None of this changes that." But even as I spoke the words, I saw the doubt lingering in his eyes. It wasn't something I could fix overnight. Rebuilding trust, especially when it came to matters of identity and self-worth, took time. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I fully understood how to navigate this new dynamic either. For so long, I'd compartmentalized my life, keeping my roles as wife, mother, and entrepreneur separate. Now those walls were crumbling, forcing all of us to adjust. Emily and Jake handled things differently. At 17, Emily was introspective and empathetic, often asking thoughtful questions about my journey and offering support in ways that surprised me. She started showing an interest in entrepreneurship herself, sketching out ideas for her own potential ventures. But there were moments when her curiosity veered into frustration. "You kept this from us for years," she said one afternoon as we sat together in the kitchen. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an edge to it, a mix of hurt and bewilderment. "Didn't you think we deserved to know?" Her words stung, not because they were unfair but because they were true. I sighed, setting aside the cup of tea I'd been sipping. "I didn't want you to see me differently," I admitted. "And maybe I didn't want to disappoint anyone. What if I failed? What if I wasn't good enough?" She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowed. Then, surprising both of us, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're human, Mom. You don't have to be perfect, but you also don't get to keep big parts of yourself hidden forever." Her wisdom floored me. In many ways she was right. I treated my success like a fragile glass ornament, too precious to share lest it shatter. Yet here she was, reminding me that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was strength. Jake, on the other hand, approached the situation with teenage pragmatism. At 15, he cared less about the emotional nuances and more about the practical implications. "So does this mean we're rich now?" he joked during breakfast one morning, spearing a piece of pancake with his fork. His attempt at humor masked deeper insecurities. He'd always struggled with academics and felt overshadowed by his older sister's achievements. My revelation added another layer of complexity to his already complicated relationship with self-esteem. "It doesn't change who we are," I told him gently, though I knew the answer wasn't satisfying. To Jake, wealth represented freedom, opportunity, and perhaps even validation. How could I explain that money didn't erase doubts or fears? That true fulfillment came from within, not from bank accounts. As these conversations unfolded, I found myself grappling with my own ambivalence. On one hand, I felt immense relief at finally being open about my business. No more hiding receipts, dodging questions, or fabricating excuses. On the other hand, the newfound transparency brought its own set of challenges. Friends began treating me differently, some with genuine admiration, others with thinly veiled envy. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about how I'd managed to pull it off. Even extended family members chimed in, offering unsolicited advice about investments, philanthropy, and lifestyle upgrades. Through it all, I clung to one truth. I hadn't built my business for recognition or approval. I'd done it because it gave me purpose, creativity, and independence. Losing sight of that would mean losing myself entirely. One evening, several weeks after the initial bombshell, Mark suggested we sit down as a family to discuss the future. By then, tensions had eased somewhat, though residual awkwardness lingered. As we gathered around the dining table, papers and laptops spread out before us, I braced myself for what promised to be a pivotal conversation. "Okay," Mark began, clearing his throat. "Let's talk about what comes next. Clearly, things are going to change. But how do we make sure those changes benefit everyone?" His question hung in the air, prompting a flurry of responses. Emily immediately launched into ideas for travel dream destinations she'd scribbled in a notebook, complete with estimated costs and itineraries. Jake chimed in with requests for upgrades, a gaming PC, a better phone, maybe even a car once he turned 16. Mark listened patiently, nodding occasionally, though I could tell he was weighing each suggestion against his own priorities. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. This was the part I dreaded, the transition from secrecy to shared responsibility. How could I balance my desire to maintain control over my business with the need to involve my family in decision-making? More importantly, how could I ensure that whatever choices we made aligned with our values rather than superficial desires? "I think we should start by focusing on what matters most," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "Yes, we have resources now that we didn't before, but money isn't the solution to every problem. If anything, it amplifies them." The room fell silent as my family absorbed my statement. Finally, Mark nodded. "You're right," he agreed. "We can't let this divide us. Whatever we decide, it has to bring us closer together, not push us apart." With that consensus, we dove into specifics. Over the course of several hours, we mapped out short-term goals, a modest vacation, paying off lingering debts, and long-term aspirations, college funds, retirement savings, charitable contributions. There were disagreements. Of course, Jake argued passionately for a luxury sports car. while Emily insisted on funding environmental causes. But through it all, we maintained a spirit of collaboration. Slowly but surely, the pieces began falling into place. Yet even as plans solidified, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on shaky ground. Money had a way of exposing fault lines, testing relationships in ways that nothing else could. Would our newfound wealth strengthen our bonds or strain them to the breaking point? Only time would tell. In the meantime, I resolved to stay grounded. Every morning, I woke early, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped outside onto the porch to watch the sunrise. Those quiet moments reminded me of why I'd started this journey in the first place, not for fame or fortune, but for the simple joy of creation. As the golden light spilled over the horizon, bathing the world in warmth, I allowed myself to dream again, not just of what lay ahead, but of who we could become together. Because ultimately, success wasn't measured in dollars or accolades. It was measured in connection, resilience, and love. And no matter what challenges awaited us, I knew one thing for certain: we'd face them side by side. As the weeks turned into months, our family dynamic shifted in subtle yet profound ways. The initial shock of my revelation gave way to a deeper understanding, a recognition that success wasn't something to fear or hide but to share and celebrate. Mark began accompanying me to business events, his pride evident as he introduced me to colleagues and partners. Emily started interning with my team during summer breaks, her creativity blossoming under mentorship. Even Jake found his footing, channeling his energy into designing eco-friendly packaging for my products. But the real transformation happened within us. We learned to communicate more openly, to embrace vulnerability instead of shying away from it. Money remained a tool, not a crutch, guiding our decisions without defining them. Together, we traveled, volunteered, and dreamed bigger than ever before. One evening, as we gathered around the fireplace, Mark raised a toast. To secrets revealed, he said with a smile, and to futures built together. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at their faces, each one illuminated by the flickering flames. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that made all the difference.